Hello again from the University of Liverpool. In this short video we're going to explore Boris Johnson's Great New Deal with the EU. What does it consist of? How new is it? How great is it? And what might happen next? Now basically Johnson's deal is a revised version of the withdrawal package that had already been signed by the UK government under Theresa May back in November 2018. Now that original package consisted of two main elements. First of all, the withdrawal agreement. That's a legally binding international treaty setting out the arrangements required simply in order to ensure that the UK's immediate exit from the EU takes place in an orderly fashion. And secondly, the political declaration. That's the mutual understanding between the EU and the UK about what the longer term relationship might look like in fields such as trade and security and so on. Now that declaration isn't legally binding. It's merely intended to lay out the basis for the next set of negotiations which will begin after the UK formally leaves. Now Johnson's Great New Deal involves changes both to the withdrawal agreement and to the political declaration. So let's look at each of them in turn, starting with the revised agreement. Though maybe not so revised agreement would be a more accurate description, because the vast majority of Johnson's treaty remains completely identical to that which was originally signed off by Theresa May. The provisions on migrant citizens' rights, on separation rules, for example winding up extradition proceedings or protecting existing intellectual property rights, the post-withdrawal status quo transitional period, the rules for calculating the UK's divorce bill, the system of governance, dispute resolution and so on, all of those provisions are exactly the same as those which Theresa May had signed just over a year ago. In fact, the only substantive change is the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. Johnson seems to have calculated that if he could find an alternative backstop for the Irish border problem, he might be able to win over enough Tory and Labour rebels to get what was otherwise exactly the same deal through the House of Commons. Now, in order to understand what Johnson has agreed, it is important to recall a few key points about the Irish border problem. Now remember that after the referendum, the UK government promised, without any real public or parliamentary debate, that the UK would leave not just the European Union, but also the customs union and the single market. So the UK would form a separate and distinct customs and regulatory territory to that of the EU itself. Now on its face, that promise meant imposing a physical frontier for the movement of goods across the island of Ireland, with all the adverse economic, social, logistical and political repercussions that any such border would inevitably entail. But at the same time, the government made a second promise: there would be no hard border in Ireland under any circumstances. Now the only way for the UK to keep its first promise, we're leaving the EU, the customs union, the single market, while also keeping its second promise, no hard border in Ireland, would be for Northern Ireland to remain closely aligned with the EU in the relevant regulatory fields, even if the rest of the UK didn't. And yet Theresa May made a third promise, under pressure from the DUP, of course, who were propping up her minority government in London, that Northern Ireland would be treated in the same way as Great Britain, and there would be no new barriers to trade within the UK itself. Now, as you've probably heard me and many others say many times, these three promises were simply irreconcilable with each other in the real world. Their mutual contradiction could only be resolved by the government breaking one of those promises, and so the only real question was which promise would be broken and who would end up being disappointed. And the answer to that question, of course, lies in the infamous Irish backstop, the insurance policy which is meant to guarantee that whatever else happens in negotiations between the EU and the UK as a whole, there would be no return to a hard border in Ireland anyway. Now, as we know, trying to figure out the detail of that backstop has been a form of torture in itself, but three main proposals have assumed either a draft or a final legal form. So let's just mention them briefly, culminating, of course, in Johnson's new backstop. In the first place, back in February 2018, the EU published a plan which would effectively have kept Northern Ireland within the EU's own customs territory and the relevant parts of the single market, and would therefore have required checks on the movement of goods between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. In other words, for the EU, the UK had to solve the Irish border problem by breaking its third promise, the promise which had been made for the benefit of the DUP. Now, the EU's proposals were rejected by the UK government out of hand on the grounds that they would undermine the territorial, the constitutional and the economic integrity of the UK itself. Now, many people were relatively unconvinced by that reasoning. After all, Northern Ireland is already treated differently from the rest of the UK for all manner of legal and regulatory purposes, but the government was nevertheless adamant in its position that this was something that no British Prime Minister could ever agree to. So the EU dropped its proposals for a Northern Irish specific backstop and asked the UK to bring forward concrete alternatives. Now, the concrete UK alternatives provided the basis for the first withdrawal agreement, which Theresa May signed off in November last year. And the centrepiece, if we remember, of that UK alternative backstop was a de facto customs union between the EU and the whole of the UK that would remove tariffs in trade between the two parties and therefore between Ireland and Northern Ireland as well. But of course this was a customs arrangement that was built almost entirely on the EU's terms. The UK would have to comply with EU rules on trade with third countries and would have to respect a whole range of EU standards in fields like competition, employment rights, environmental protection and so on, so as to guarantee a level playing field. And of course this was also a customs union with no fixed expiry date. The two parties might hope to replace this backstop in due course with a better alternative arrangement, but there was no guarantee that that would happen within any particular period of time, or indeed that it would happen at all. And so once activated, Theresa May's backstop would have remained in place until the EU itself agreed to amend, replace or abolish it. Now that EU-UK customs union, as proposed by Theresa May, wasn't the only element of the previous withdrawal agreement. After all, dealing with import duties only solves half the Irish border problem. You still have the challenge of avoiding the need for extensive checks on goods moving between Northern Ireland and the Republic so as to guarantee compliance with a range of core EU regulatory standards. Now, to achieve that, Theresa May's withdrawal treaty partially resurrected the EU's original backstop proposals because they said that Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland alone would remain subject to the relevant EU rules and procedures, which would in turn mean certain checks on trade and goods between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. In other words, the UK's alternative backstop under Theresa May sought to resolve the Irish border problem partly by breaking the government's own first promise, because the UK would actually remain in a form of customs union with the EU, but also by partly breaking the government's third promise, because Northern Ireland would to some extent be treated separately from Great Britain. So small wonder, of course, that many people were opposed to Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, not least, in fact especially, among her own backbenchers and her DUP allies. So that brings us on then to what Boris Johnson has agreed in his third backstop proposal. And this is the one which was agreed with the EU last month and which he now wants us to endorse through the medium of the general election. Now essentially, Theresa May's UK-wide backstop has been replaced with another Northern Ireland specific backstop. Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland alone will remain subject to large swathes of EU legislation, for example on customs, on VAT, on the trade in goods, on energy, on state aid and so on a dynamic basis and in accordance with evolving EU case law. And by those means, the EU and the UK can avoid creating a hard border across the island of Ireland, but this proposal does involve significant concessions on both sides. On the EU side, the remaining member states have accepted that many of the EU's own rules will be enforced on the ground by UK bodies. Now, it's true that those UK agents will be subject to EU supervision, and institutions such as the Commission and the Court of Justice will continue to exercise their jurisdiction in respect of Northern Ireland, but the EU has accepted that its own external border will be policed by a third country. And indeed, as the Commission's ongoing dispute with the UK demonstrates, it's a third country that stands accused of negligently failing to tackle serious VAT fraud as regards the importation of third country goods into the single market. Hardly a promising start. On the UK side, though, there were also some major compromises. Customs and regulatory checks will take place on trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In fact, Boris Johnson simply dumped his DUP allies and ditched the UK's third promise, signing up to something that we were told no British Prime Minister could ever sign up to because it would destroy the territorial, constitutional and economic integrity of the country. But it's in his protocol in black and white. So when Boris Johnson flippantly talks about unfettered trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, or binning trade checks, either he doesn't actually understand his own deal, or he's actively being dishonest about its implications for political purposes, or he's somehow planning to break the UK's clear international legal obligations, none of those explanations being particularly flattering, of course. But in any case, Johnson's New Deal also differs from the EU's original proposals for a Northern Ireland only backstop, because formally Northern Ireland will remain part of the UK's customs territory, which means that Northern Ireland will become subject to two distinct and divergent customs regimes running simultaneously, with some goods subject to EU rules and other goods subject to UK rules, depending on their origin and their destination. And that will necessitate a complex system to track and check goods and to reimburse traders, for example, so as to ensure that they're paying the correct taxes and observing the correct rules. Now that idea of having two separate and divergent customs regimes simultaneously in respect of the same territory was actually first suggested by the UK government in its so-called Checkers Plan back in July 2018. And at the time it was rejected by commentators and by experts as being untested, speculative, bureaucratic and uncompetitive. And in fact, Boris Johnson, if you recall, actually resigned from his cabinet position in government on the grounds that he could never support such an arrangement. And yet this is exactly the arrangement which is now being proposed by Boris Johnson for Northern Ireland. Now, people in Northern Ireland keep being told you should be delighted with this deal, you're going to have the best of both worlds. But in fact, Northern Ireland will be worse off under the Johnson plan than it would have been either under the previous EU backstop proposal or indeed under Theresa May's backstop proposal. Which brings us to one final key point about the backstop. This is no longer actually a backstop at all. In reality, this new arrangement will be permanent. In fact, the only way for Northern Ireland to escape what is actually a suboptimal customs and trade regime will be to vote either for reunification with the Republic or for the imposition of a hard border upon itself at some stage in the future. Hardly a very satisfactory position. But that is the new withdrawal agreement which has been agreed by Boris Johnson. Avoid a hard border in Ireland, but to do so essentially by separating Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK and imposing customs and regulatory checks across the Irish Sea, but at the same time subjecting Northern Ireland to a twin customs regime with the potential for serious complexity and bureaucracy. So much for the revised withdrawal agreement. What then about the revised political declaration, which sets out, as we said before, the EU-UK mutual understanding on new arrangements in fields such as trade and the economy and security? Now here, the text of the new political declaration does contain various amendments. For example, the UK has made it clear that it merely wants a free trade agreement, nothing more ambitious, nothing more far-reaching. That also means downgrading the future plans for smooth customs procedures between the two parties, as well as deleting any reference to the UK's future alignment with EU rules on trade in goods, as well as trade in services. There's also a substantial redrafting of the section on the level playing field guarantees in fields like environmental law and employment law. Now, on the one hand, it's important not to get too bogged down in the detailed text of this revised political declaration. After all, it's not legally binding. The negotiations will only start after the UK has actually left. They may take a considerable period of time, and they may well produce a future relationship which is entirely different from the one envisaged by this declaration itself. Indeed, they may not produce any particular future relationship at all. On the other hand, the revised political declaration, especially when read together with the new Irish protocol, is highly revealing about Johnson's plans for the future. And there are three key points to make here, just briefly. First of all, the Tories clearly now want a much more distant economic relationship between the UK and the EU, even more distant than what had previously been proposed by Theresa May, which was already pretty far apart. Those sectors and businesses which might have hoped that the future relationship between the EU and the UK would ultimately shield them from the very worst economic consequences of Brexit really need to think again. For many people, the difference between these revised terms of future relationships and simply not having any deal at all will be minimal, if not indiscernible. Second point, The UK's legally binding commitments, even to maintain current standards of employment or environmental protection as contained in the previous UK-wide backstop of Theresa May, have simply been eliminated. There's now nothing more than a vague political aspiration to maintain current standards and not even a vague political aspiration to pursue better standards into the future. And it's quite clear, I think, that the Tories are actively clearing away any remaining obstacles to exactly the sort of radical, once-in-a-generation transformation of the UK economy and UK society that so many of their hard-right members and backers have long dreamed of and indeed long blamed EU membership on preventing. And the third key point is that the real focus of Johnson's Great New Deal seems to be on ensuring the UK's almost total freedom to engage in future trade negotiations with third countries, using our own regulatory and social and welfare standards as a bargaining tool in trade talks with countries like the US or China. Now, it simply seems incredible that anyone could seriously believe that the UK on its own is capable of exercising the same, let alone a greater, degree of influence over the terms of international trade, whether multilaterally or bilaterally, than we've enjoyed through our membership of the EU. Even in the right hands, our international influence will be diminished. In the wrong hands, we could be signing away the crown jewels for not very much in return. So what happens next with Johnson's not so great and really not very new deal? Obviously, reaction within the UK to the Johnson deal was quite mixed and quite fragmented, but there did seem to be a good chance that Johnson would eventually have mustered sufficient votes in the Commons to approve this withdrawal package and proceed with Brexit on these terms. Perhaps not dying in a ditch on the 31st of October, but especially because the EU 27 had agreed a further extension with a break clause permitting an early withdrawal if the UK ratified this package sooner. Yet Boris Johnson decided not to continue trying to steer this Great New Deal through Parliament and instead, of course, sought a general election for December. And surely, I think, one of Johnson's chief motivations for doing so was quite simply to avoid any serious parliamentary scrutiny of his revised withdrawal package, the type of scrutiny that would actually have highlighted its undoubted significant weaknesses and its undoubted equally serious risks. Instead, of course, if Johnson wins a Commons majority in December, he can simply force this deal through Parliament without having to explain its faults, without particularly having to care about its consequences. But even assuming that that happens and Johnson delivers Brexit in January 2020, is that the same as getting Brexit done? And the answer, of course, is no. In fact, this is one of the biggest contracts of the lot, because leaving the EU on Johnson's terms just means finishing the first stage of the Brexit process and beginning the next stage of the Brexit process. If the UK is serious about a future partnership with the EU, those talks will be even more complex, even more sensitive than the ones we've experienced so far. Though the question does need to be asked, I think, is Johnson really serious about a future partnership with the EU at all? Because there is plenty of evidence to suggest otherwise. In particular, the withdrawal agreement provides for a transitional period that should last until the end of December 2020, during which the status quo is effectively maintained while the EU and the UK negotiate their future relationship. Now, there's no real credible chance that that complex, sensitive set of negotiations and agreements will be concluded, ratified, ready to enter into force by December 2020. And for that reason, the withdrawal agreement includes a one-off power to extend the transitional period by an extra 12 or 24 months, provided that extension decision is agreed by July 2020 at the latest. Yet Boris Johnson has repeatedly ruled out the idea that the UK would actually request or agree to any such extension under any circumstances. And that means that Johnson's Great New Deal really will have simply postponed by several months the no deal outcome that many of his hard right supporters had been lobbying for earlier this autumn. And indeed, that seems to have been one of the main reasons why Nigel Farage, for example, decided to stand down so many of his own Brexit Party limited candidates so that he could support Boris Johnson's chances of winning the general election, and then together they could deliver the no-deal Brexit that they really want next year. Let's wrap up. One should always give credit where credit is due. Leave campaigners have done a really excellent job of helping everybody forget about the referendum fear-mongering. We haven't been conscripted into an EU army, we haven't been overrun with Turkish immigrants. They've done an even better job of making everyone forget all of those referendum promises. The extra money for the NHS that was promised on the side of the bus, the EU begging on its hands and knees for a great deal with the UK. And indeed they've succeeded by an equally effective process of manipulation and radicalisation in totally redefining what Brexit actually means, so that only the very hardest, the most extreme form of rupture away from the EU is even to be considered a valid or acceptable form of withdrawal. But most of all, this extreme Brexit, which is effectively unrecognisable from what people were promised back in 2016, is now being sold primarily on the basis that we should simply support Boris Johnson to get Brexit done. It's a very clever and very effective form of political messaging, of course, but it's also completely and thoroughly dishonest, because we are still only in the infant stage of this particular disease. Many of us will be dead and buried while our children and grandchildren are still trying to figure out the mess and undo the damage which will have been caused to the country by this Great New Deal secured by Boris Johnson. And as many Leavers like to try and forget, even if Boris Johnson gets his way and Brexit is done next January, millions of their fellow citizens will simply immediately start working to get the UK back into the EU again. So even getting Brexit done is really likely to be more than just a temporary victory.